Go. Okay. So today's class we're going to talk about, it's the first of two classes where we'll talk about field work. And we're kind of going to do the same thing that we did with culture and that we will do with language, where in the first class we'll talk about sort of the essential need for this in our toolkit as a great tool to have. And then in the next class we'll kind of examine, well, does it always work, or is it working out there beyond sort of the anthropological perspective? Does it help you to do what you want to do? And fieldwork is an essential tool for anthropologists, and I think it's a great thing to learn how to do. It's what a lot of people who want to be in anthropology or admire what cultural anthropologists do, it's what they kind of want to do, is to be able to go into another place, another society in some cases, or even your own community, and sort of be immersed in that place and try to figure out what's going on culturally from the perspective of the people that are there, talking to people and really putting yourself as a learner or as a person who is learning from the people that is there, learning with other people, as some anthropologists have described it. So it is one of the things that people do field work now in other disciplines. I know over in education, for example, there's a component of ethnographic field work that they do. But it's something that in some ways anthropology, was a pioneer, sort of gifted to a lot of disciplines, is the idea of doing this thing we call ethnographic field work. I want to start by sharing something that one of my professors said or wrote. He called it a traditional anthropological catechism. And for those of you who haven't been through the Catholic catechism recently, a catechism is sort of a statement of belief, or the things that we hold dearest to us, or we believe the most. And this, like I said, I had the privilege, the great privilege of being able to take a couple classes with Professor Sidney Mintz. He was already a pretty old anthropologist at the time, but he had an amazing eye for learning from other people, for doing ethnographic fieldwork. And when I went away to do my own fieldwork in Colombia, I wrote him back about an account of how we had, in that part of Colombia, one of the best things you can eat for a festival, I don't want to gross people out, is a roast guinea pig. And I gave him a description of like what it was like to do that. And, it was him writing me back a letter about how great that was to read that description. It was one of the things that most influenced me to kind of continue on in anthropology. He's a great field worker, and he appears in the Guest book on page 73. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Guest annoyingly misspells his name. He spells it S-Y-D-N-E-Y, which would probably make him into a woman, but his actual name is Sidney Mintz with an I. So this is what Mintz said, that he sort of said was our traditional anthropological belief or catechism about doing field work. His advice to us. So study what you can see and hear, record everything you can, do not expect it to be entirely consistent. And a lot of you, I know when you went out, you recorded things into your phones, which is a new technique. We used to all have notebooks and try to write them down, and there's a new thing, but it's still, you still have to do this recording of everything you can, and a lot of times people want to find patterns immediately, but Mintz tells us, just record what you can, but don't expect to find it all consistent. Life is going to be inconsistent. And then he tells us to listen, and I pause here on this word listen, because I think it's somewhat essential to anthropology and essential to the perspective of what it means to be a good anthropologist, is to be an attentive listener. And I know in your field work, we were just sort of often observing from a distance. As many of you put it, you couldn't hear or you couldn't listen to conversations, you couldn't participate in those conversations. I don't want you to, because then we'd be talking loudly to each other, and I just told you about that. But anthropology is often about listening in the sense of taking other people seriously, really listening to people who haven't necessarily been listened to by other people in the past. And so this is a crucial component to anthropology. Then Mintz wrote that we should count the ancillary blessings of discomfort, which maybe some anthropological fieldwork doesn't have as much discomfort as it did in the day, but one of the things that anthropologists often had to do was sort of leave whatever place they were in and put themselves in a different, more uncomfortable place. And when Guest asks you during your fieldwork, did you feel like you could take notes? Did you feel comfortable? Part of what Mintz is telling us is, draw on that discomfort while you're, while you are able to. And more words. If those items in the catechism do not add up to a methodology for other sterner disciplines, so be it. So what Mintz is saying here, and I think it's kind of important, is that there wasn't a huge method that anthropology had. It's not a very a lot of it wasn't a mathematical, quantitative, hypothesis testing discipline. So what you learn about in other places, the scientific method and how you have to have a hypothesis and how you have to then go in and disprove or falsify the hypothesis, and it's often very quantitative or based on survey research. The central method of anthropology in some ways was just go there and listen and, try to figure out what's going on. And that was, as Mintz said, well, maybe somebody doesn't consider that scientific, but that's what we did. And so what he says, he believes that revealed worlds otherwise hidden or unimagined, that by just going to places that no one had gone to as a researcher before, that no one had taken seriously, it revealed a number of things about humanity and about the human condition, about people in other parts of the world that had never been seen before, and really changed the way people looked at others and their ideas about the world. So this was, like I said, this is just to say that that fieldwork has been crucial to anthropology as a discipline and as a method, as a research technique. This is kind of a central part of our concerns. Hang on, need a little water. Okay. So, Guest says similar things in the sort of what fieldwork is or what fieldwork should be, I would say. As Mintz put it, fieldwork should be able to reveal things that otherwise would have gone unnoticed. So documenting the lifeways of other peoples and bringing out things that might not have been discovered had people not been there. The importance really of simply serendipity or chance of being in the right place at the right time, or when things go wrong, and being able to record that is crucial to fieldwork. The other thing that fieldwork should be is it should provide evidence for the idea of culture, the sort of the good part of the idea of culture that we learned about in our second week of class. And so if you remember, that was when we talked about how the group of what they were called the renegade anthropologists changed our ideas of race, sex, and gender. In some ways, it was partially based on ideas about how people did things, but it was also based on the evidence of going into other societies and learning from the people there. It's very difficult to maintain a racist position when the people you are studying, you're dependent upon them for your own growth and survival. It's very difficult to sort of set up a hierarchy between us and them, of superiority and inferiority, if you've seen firsthand the technical skills and the intelligence of the people that you are learning from. It's very difficult to come up with a kind of biological or environmental determinist stance if you can see for yourself how much individual and group variation there is, even within a similar geographic area. And so in an ideal sense, what fieldwork did was provide kind of the empirical basis for the kinds of things that Boas and Mead and Benedict and some of these early anthropologists were telling us. It was based upon their own studies in other societies. And so Ruth Benedict's book, Patterns of Culture, which we talked about, was in some ways reporting on 3 different anthropologists and their field work that they had done in 3 different societies. Ideally also, as Guest tells us here on page 66, he talks about it as fieldwork shapes the anthropologist. Fieldwork should be transformative, that there should be a growth in the openness and tolerance, and it should sort of report back on that to the people who are eventually going to be reading about the fieldwork or thinking about it. One of the things that the anthropologist Tim Ingold, which I had some of you read in Intro to Anthropology with me, talks about participant observation as studying with. So it's not the study of, it's not studying another, it is studying with other people and really trying to learn from them about how to speculate on the conditions of life. I want to be clear here, this tripped up a couple people on the quiz. This doesn't mean that the anthropologist ever sort of goes native. The anthropologist remains an observer. We know too well that that's kind of a mythology that you can sort of jump into another society and try to be like, become one with them. Anthropologists don't do that. We never try to be incognito. We always try to announce our intentions and that we are doing a study, but it's not in order to be sort of, a member of that society. You sort of retain this place between both worlds, and you participate as much as possible to a point, but you're maintaining fundamentally the stance that you're doing a study. You're not becoming someone that you are not. Now, like I said, this was the ideal of anthropology and of anthropological fieldwork. In the 1940s, 50s, maybe in the 1960s, anthropology developed what anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot called a fieldwork trilogy. And it was it became something of a rite of passage that if you studied anthropology, you then did a certain form of fieldwork. And the fieldwork trilogy that Trouillot and others were talking about is that you had one person, one field worker, who would go to sort of one community or one small village or small place and stay there for 1 year. And you'd do that, and then you'd come back and you'd write it up into your dissertation, and then they'd give you a PhD, and then you'd start teaching classes. And so it became a kind of ticket into academia. I mean, on the one hand, people really wanted to know about the world out there, but it also became a sort of way to become an anthropologist, that you did your one single field work in one place and for one set amount of time, and then you came back into teaching. Now, there were certainly a number of advantages to this model. If you had only one person, it really forced you to immerse yourself in whatever place you were. And so, it would be impossible to avoid in some ways doing this kind of immersive experience of fieldwork. So that was, one of the reasons you wanted to be perhaps by yourself. If you had one small place, one village, it allowed you to get to know everyone in that place. The idea was that in a limited amount of time, you could know all the people who lived there, 250 people or 400 people, that you would have this sort of in-depth experience in one place where you could actually get a kind of complete picture of this one community or one place. The other thing that was going on during this time is anthropology was a very young discipline. There weren't that many anthropologists. And so part of the idea of the Fieldwork Trilogy, the reason why people went all over the place as single field workers, were the idea that, hey, there's a lot of stuff to be gotten out there. We have to get out there and get it before it's gone or before it disappears. And so the idea was we'd send people into different far-flung parts of the world, and you'd go to one place as one field worker. The advantage of being there for 1 year, the idea was from our own society, is that if you were in a place for 1 year, you went through the full seasonal cycle. So if you were studying an agricultural society, you'd be there through the planting, the growing, and the harvest. It was assumed that many religious rituals or societal rituals occur on an annual basis, which tends to be true, so that you could observe kind of one full ritual cycle while you were there. So this was became itself a sort of ritual for anthropologists to do this one field worker, one village, 1 year thing. Now, as we're talking about the Fieldwork Trilogy, I also want to talk about the things that we would not see in this situation. What we might miss because we were only one field worker, one village, 1 year. And hopefully you can see I've popped on a few names to talk about some of these aspects. So let me first start with the one field worker issue. One of the things we maybe miss if we are only one field worker is that we only get one perspective on things. And I kind of noticed this. My first field work I did individually, and then I went back for some other field work, which I did with a colleague. We kind of worked a bit on, sort of a team, and it was really interesting to compare what I thought of things and what he thought of things, even observing the same stuff. You'd be able to talk about things and maybe even come up with different perspectives. And it was interesting for me to read. I know some of you went out on your field work together, which is probably good considering some of the things that happened. And it's interesting to compare what happens when you go out as a team as opposed to when you're just sort of by yourself, kind of brewing on things all by yourself. It creates a different kind of dynamic. So the other thing I want to talk about was something we would not see in the fieldwork thing is what happens when there is gendered relationships involved. And so something I asked Caitlin M. Montgomery to talk about is what happened around the street around the Latte Lounge. Caitlin, you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So my roommate and I were sitting outside the Latte Lounge, and there was these two girls at a table somewhat near us on the sidewalk. And as they crossed the street, this late 40 to early 50s year old guy starts following them around and harassing them, saying he wants them to be his girlfriends or whatever. And they're these college-aged girls. And then they ducked into a shop to get away from this guy, and he starts following two other girls who were probably about college age, and then they just kept walking, and eventually he just stopped following them. And that's when my roommate and I decided to leave, and we were pretty freaked out all the way back to campus.
Oh, I'm very disturbed by this. I actually, my 16-year-old daughter is here and she's reporting similar things going on. Well, she'll be walking down the street and a guy will like drive around and then drive around the block and be like, hey, beautiful, and then drive. And we're trying to figure out if like, I think you and your roommate said, well, this hasn't changed that much. I feel like it might be happening more, maybe more in coronavirus times. I can't tell just because these guys should be doing other stuff than what they're doing. But I guess what I'd like to talk about in terms of, you know, the fieldwork aspect of this is it's very difficult sometimes if you are, you know, a woman or someone who might be transgender who goes into a society or a place or even your own home that might be not very accepting, or how to say, that might have this kind of, you know, on street or public harassment. It makes can make field work difficult, if not dangerous, and it's something that is probably not talked about enough in anthropology. It also happens within fieldwork teams. So, you know, I mean, this is something that a lot of archaeologists have been trying to address, how, you know, there can be this kind of, there can often be harassment from sort of senior scholars to more junior scholars within a fieldwork team. So this was a huge problem of the kind of, especially of the single field worker model if you're in another society. Caitlin Smith, I think, I want if you would talk to us a little bit about the gendered groups you saw over in Stack Lounge.
So yeah, when I was in Stack Lounge, I noticed that there were more group of guys, because there was, on the TVs, there were football games, so I guess football, you kind of correlate with, you know, guys, so like, I just noticed there were more group of guys than girls that night.
Yeah, so this is something, you know, I mean, the other thing that, you know, apart from the harassment, a lot of times in society, people tend to move and congregate in gendered groups. And probably, you know, there's this, you know, you assume that you probably could have gotten access to that group if you wanted to, but in other societies, it can be very difficult and it can work in different ways. I know that, you know, when I was doing my own field work, it was sometimes difficult to just get out of sort of where the men wanted to be and go and be with women who were cooking the food in the kitchen. And so, you know, a lot of times people will prohibit the anthropologist from going into a different group just simply based on the different worlds in which society can be gendered. And of course, this can be especially difficult if you're not identifying as a non-binary person. So, you know, I mean, it's something that when we just have one field worker in a setting, they may miss a whole side of society that you need sort of more teamwork to reveal. All right, talk a little bit about the one village aspect of this. One of the things, of course, you miss from just being in one village is sort of the wider society, the things that are going on outside of it, the interconnections. Of course, if you're only in a village, how do you ever study what urban life is like in cities? So, you know, this is sort of a very simple thing, but, you know, just getting to know one place doesn't give you that sense of what's going on throughout the society. The other thing I would mention, and this may sound simple, but it's kind of a point that is in other ways extremely important for your study, which is that you don't ever see the people who have already left. And for those of you who grew up like I did in a small town, most of your life you probably spend wanting to get out of that small town. And so the people who are kind of still in the small town may not be the best representatives of what that town was like before. So it's hard to see how many people have left the place that they are. And, you know, as we talked about, interconnection and migrating is a fundamental to the human experience. And if you're sort of only doing field work in places where people are more rooted, you know, you don't see the people who are migrating back and forth to cities or to other places. In a similar way, it's difficult when you're doing the village study to see how much the outside has influenced what's going on. How much that, you know, how much life is sometimes shaped by forces that are beyond wherever you are. That can be hard to see when you're doing your one village study. The other thing I want to talk about is sort of the duration here. A year is both a long time in some ways, but it's also, of course, a very short time. And it can be very difficult to get a sense of history and historical perspective. Actually, I wanted to turn to Rachel's observations. I think, Rachel, you were observing people on the street, maybe Maple Street, somewhere around there. What do you notice about how people were moving about these days?
So I've noticed that, yeah, it was Maple Street, but I've noticed that people were not as close together, that they were socially distancing, and was that if they crossed the street together on the sidewalk, that they would try to create as much space in between them. I also noticed that everybody likes to wear a mask, or a lot of people do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was interested in this, and I know some of you live in other places where things seem completely the same as they were before, which is perhaps scarier to me than what Rachel reported. But what's striking, I think, and you know, I've thought about this myself walking along, is how, you know, crossing the street when I see someone else approaching is just kind of natural to me now. And it's, you know, and it seems to be natural to other people. It's just, you know, and so the thing is it doesn't take very long for our habits to feel like we've been doing it forever. And so, you know, this is something that, you know, we've only been doing for 6 months or so, but it doesn't take very long in human life in order to create this sense of timelessness. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get that historical sense of what might life have been like in the past. Humans' historical memory is notoriously short. So, I mean, you know, if you think back to things that happened in your parents' or your grandparents' lifetimes, you know, they may have had a very different experience of the world, but it's so difficult to think of, you know, I mean, I grew up most of my life without a cell phone, but it's actually difficult for me to remember not having one of those things and not being able to call people up or message people. And so these things that come into our lives, they become sort of, it doesn't take very long before they're just assumed to exist there forever. I think that's difficult for anthropologists doing field work is oftentimes there may not be historical archives. The archives might be in a completely different language than the one that you're learning in your field site. So this can be a very difficult thing to do, but it's crucial to sort of get to that. I think I wanted to say is that it's very difficult to get a sense of the global interconnection from doing this kind of field work. And I say this sort of in reference to kind of the earliest anthropological field work, when people were out there doing what Guest and others call salvage ethnography. And the idea was we have to capture the artifacts and the customs of these non-Western societies before they disappear. And so we're going to go in there and, you know, dig things up and grab artifacts and put them in museums and record all these stories. And one of the problems of that is that these societies had already been interacting and changing. All societies, all cultures are changing, but you know, a lot of them were, for example, had already incorporated horses from European societies. Of course, Native Americans before there was the European Native American exchange did not have horses. Similarly, other societies around the world had adopted corn and tobacco and potatoes. And a lot of these things, kind of like what we said before with history, they get rapidly adopted into society so that within one generation, it's impossible to imagine life without horses, or, you know, I mean, it's impossible to imagine Italian cuisine, for example, without tomatoes, and yet we know that tomatoes came from the New World. And so, you know, before Columbus, there were no tomatoes in Italy. It's probably hard to imagine Irish life in Ireland without potatoes, but again, potatoes were from the New World. So in both directions, or in all directions, there were these global interconnections, and it was these things became very incorporated into these societies, almost unnoticed, so that people had no idea of their sources. I was thinking about this with Shayna's field work out at Buffalo Wild Wings, I think, and with something that many of you talked about when you observed the situation around you, which was a sense of, I think, well, how do you put it, Shayna? Sadness, maybe?
Yeah.
What was it like? What were things like before, and what made you sad to see them now?
With mine particularly, like this time last year, since it's football season, like we used to have like the whole restaurant full of people and like the football game over the speakers, and everyone would be like yelling and cheering together and talking to people they've never met before. And it was just always something going on. But I feel like lately it's like we don't get anybody, and I'm lucky to get like 10 tables, and it's just kind of sad. Like it's the start of football season and it doesn't feel like it. You know what I mean? Like it just feels not right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear you. There is, you know, there's a lot of sadness, and the reason I kind of brought that up, a number of you said that it seems sadder now in some ways, the sociality that we had once assumed. And I bring that up because, you know, a lot of the societies that anthropologists were studying during the early days of anthropology were in some ways kind of in a similar, I would say, sadness. They had sort of lost a lot of their population. They had been moved around. They had been displaced. And so a lot of the times when anthropologists were recording these things, it may have been difficult to get that sense of like, well, what was life like, you know, before some of these displacements, before some of these forced migrations, before some of the population losses that came from you know, I mean, the epidemics that swept through the Native American and indigenous societies. I think we're somehow getting a slight sense of that now. But I mean, if you think about what smallpox and did to people in the Americas, it was, you know, it was extremely devastating, and it was difficult to understand. You know, if you wanted to sort of salvage what was going on, it probably was almost impossible to understand what was happening before there was this interconnection. So now, there were a number of attempts, or there have been a number of attempts in anthropology to move beyond this idea of, you know, one field worker, 1 year, one village. And so Guest mentioned several of them in the textbook, and I wanted to highlight them. So going back to Sidney Mintz and Eric Wolf, who I mentioned, I think in the first part of the first week, they were together with 3 other anthropologists and their supervisor, Julian Stewart, for something called the People of Puerto Rico Project. And what Julian Stewart did, and so Wolf and Mintz were students on this project, he put sort of 5 people in 5 different communities, and it was, and they, you know, they each did their own individual field work, but they would meet and talk about it, and they wrote it up together. And so this is a different approach than the single field worker. It was a teamwork project. And the other crucial difference is that it was about a contemporary society, and it was not trying to sort of rescue sort of the indigenous or pre-existing ideas. It really wanted to document what was happening in a colonial context, what was happening with the spread of capitalism and capitalistic relationships. Mintz was writing about sugarcane plantations, and and he would go on, both Mintz and Wolf would go on from there to be descriptors of this, this huge transformation in our lives when sugar became a commodity that was that became part of our diets. And so this was a very different approach to anthropological fieldwork. They also did fieldwork among people who would be considered agriculturalists or peasants, so they weren't at all tribal or hunter-gatherers. You know, so it was not, as Mintz put it, this was not the stuff that anthropological dreams had been made of before. This was a very different kind of study, and it launched a whole attention to people's incorporation into capitalism that both Mintz and Wolf would continue throughout their lives. Guest also talks about Annette Weiner and her work. She actually went back into a very famous field workers field site, Malinowski's Trobriand Islands field site, and sort of years later kind of re-examined that. So that's where you'd have this kind of reflexivity where instead of, you know, everybody does their own study and you never go back, you'd actually look back onto yourself as a field worker and examine the field work of others before. And then of course the insight, you know, I mean, when Mintz and Wolf were on their team, it was like 5 guys out there. Well, you know, Weiner and others brought feminism and you know, the attention to gender into the picture when we're talking about fieldwork. And like we mentioned before, it's sometimes very difficult to get a sense of what the women are doing if you're a man, and some men probably don't even bother to look. And so, you know, it was important to have this kind of gendered perspective and to understand how feminism could inform our fieldwork. The other person Guest mentions, Barbara Myerhoff, and she was one of the people who kind of pioneered studying in your own. She did her sort of outside the US fieldwork, but then some of her most interesting fieldwork was when she came back and did a study of sort of an aging Jewish community. And so, you know, a number of anthropologists started saying that we needed to study in our own societies as much as we need to study abroad. So these are 3 examples, and there, you know, there are lots. These are just 3 perhaps of the famous examples of people who tried to kind of move anthropological fieldwork in a different in a different way than it had before, beyond what we might consider the typical trilogy of anthropological fieldwork. So this is actually the question that I'll be asking you to reflect upon your own fieldwork, and as we go into Wednesday's class, is what happened to this new perspective? And I say, you know, did it work in the sense that you know, I think that a lot of people still very much imagine that if you're doing an anthropological fieldwork, you are way off in the jungle, in some crazy place, you know, and so to what extent did these new approaches in anthropology get out into the world in order to convince people about, you know, the importance of, say, the spread of capitalism or feminism, or that anthropologists study at home as well as abroad. You know, I think to a certain extent, just to sort of preview my own answer to this, we still expect anthropologists to give us this kind of crazy, exotic, and probably, you know, the anthropological studies that still get read and heard about are the old ones, you know, the Margaret Mead studies and these kinds of things. You know, the three people I just named are hardly people that anyone's ever heard about or read outside of anthropology. So that will be our kind of question for Wednesday, is to what extent was anthropology really able to remake its fieldwork and to sort of make it into something that could reach people beyond what they'd done before. Questions?